Welcome, everybody, to tonight's conversation in the framework of the Pocket Project at COP26, where we come together to restore our relationship to ourselves, to the planet, and find a way of responding more adequately. And I'm really delighted to be here tonight with Jojo and Mehta. So, Jojo works on installing the law of ecocide. And ecocide is a word that is used to describe what is happening to life on our planet. The mass damage, the destruction of the natural living world. And it really means killing one's home. So quite a chilling topic, but very adequate for the environment that we're in. This is what we're addressing together here. Yeah, and Jojo Mehta co-founded Stop Ecocide in 2017 alongside legal pioneer, the late Polly Higgins, who was a friend of us both, a very, very inspiring woman. And they both founded this organization together to help make creating severe harm to nature an international crime. Quite a strong task to set oneself, and we'll hear more about that. And as the campaign's executive director and key spokesperson, Jojo has overseen the remarkable growth of the global movement while coordinating legal developments, diplomatic traction, and public narrative. So thank you so much, Jojo. And I know you're super busy at this time, also around COP26. So we're really grateful to you for taking time. And yeah, we already just spoke for a little bit, woman to woman, about how it is to be woman, be a mother, have incredibly busy lives, be so engaged in the world. So maybe you can just tell us a bit more about the inner motivation that brought you to this work.
I think I probably have to go back quite a long way to the real foundations of it in my childhood. And that would be to my mother, who is a singer and a songwriter and a poet, and whose deep inspiration has always been the earth and nature. And she's also an amazing naturalist. And I remember going for walks with her as a child, and she would be telling me the names of all the flowers and you know, kind of sort of instilling in me a kind of very kind of fundamental underlying awareness of the immediacy of the natural world around me. And it was something that probably kind of bubbled underneath for quite a long time. I mean, as a teenager, I wanted to go live in the city, and you know, it was a very different kind of a feeling, I suppose, for me at that time in my life, and wanting to be sociable and wanting to be around people and in city environments. And it was when I moved back to my hometown, which is Stroud in Gloucestershire, which is also where Polly spent her last few years, that I really reconnected to the land here. And I really realized how much that landscape was sort of in my being. And I had a really sort of strong experience of feeling very connected to the land. And now that in the work that we do, we actually work with Indigenous leaders quite a bit. And one of the things that I've really noticed is that when they introduce themselves, they always talk about the land that they come from. And you hear that also, especially whenever we speak in Australia, obviously online. The first thing is the naming of country, you know, where you've come from. And my sense is that in our kind of, you know, largely Western dominating culture, we've sort of lost that sense of roots and that sense of belonging to the land as opposed to owning the land, which is, when you think about it, something of an absurdity. And so I suppose when I now work from here, from this beautiful place in the west of England, and it does feel very deeply to be home. And there's something that relates very strongly to my work in that whole feeling, because as you said in your introduction, I mean, ecocide means to kill one's home. And, we're kind of in the process, our culture has been in the process of doing that over the last, couple of centuries, and especially in the last few decades. And so to sort of feel a very strong sense of rootedness in a landscape and commitment to that landscape, to me feels very, very relevant to the work I'm now doing.
Yeah, beautiful. And I just want to echo your words about, the landscape. You found that the landscape was a part of your being. It felt like it was a part of your being, and you felt your connection to the land, and just how precious those experiences are. There's something where it really, I can feel the grounding in your body as you speak about it. Yeah. Yeah, and just bringing in a quote by Polly, which I find really inspiring. Also because I think many of us somehow take our legal systems as given and are not fully aware just how historically and human-made they are. So she says, the rules of our world are laws, and they can be changed. Laws can restrict or they can enable. What matters is what they serve. Many of the laws in our world serve property. They are based on the protection of ownership. But imagine a law that has a higher moral authority, a law that puts people and planet first. Imagine a law that starts from first, do no harm, then stop this dangerous game and take us to a place of safety. And I find that so touching because in our work on individual, ancestral, and collective trauma, and the restoration of that, we sometimes see that trauma is born from the transgression of this higher moral authority. We would call it the sacred law, as also many Indigenous people call it, the sacred law of the earth. And that actually the healing or the integration of trauma is based on the restoration of sacred law. And it feels like that's also why I really wanted to bring you in, because I feel that is what you are working on in that outer reality in our systems, in our world systems, on the restoration of sacred law through the installation of the Ecocide law. So maybe you could just tell us a bit more about the law and how you experience this law of ownership that protects ownership versus sacred law.
Absolutely. I think I think you've really touched on something there that is fundamental to our work, I think, in the sense that, and this is understood by Indigenous cultures in many parts of the world very profoundly. It's a reality. When we damage Mother Earth or creation or nature, whatever name we want to give to this beautiful planet, when we damage Mother Earth, there are consequences. That's actually not something we dream up in our heads. That's actually physical fact, and on a certain level, it's spiritual fact as well. And so, in a way, how I think of what we're doing is almost what we're aiming to do is to integrate that reality into the system by which the human law system that we've evolved, so that it actually reflects what happens in the world. We're starting to see with ever more apocalyptic clarity, what the results are of serious destruction of our planet. And so it's almost, it feels, externally, politically, it feels like the right moment, but obviously, internally and within some parts of the world and our organization, of course, as well, it feels long overdue. It feels like, this is something that should have been acknowledged many years ago. And even historically, there have been moments when it could have been, and that was one of the things that Polly discovered when she started investigating how can we create a legal duty of care for the planet, because that was the question that drove her and that led her to this idea of criminalizing ecocide. And she discovered that the governing document of the International Criminal Court when it was being drafted in the 1990s, originally was intended to include severe harm to the environment. And it was a clause that never made the final treaty, which just when it first came into being had the three war crimes, genocide, and crimes against humanity.
Just slow down. Can you just say that again?
Yeah. Sorry. Polly discovered that during the drafting of the Rome Statute, which is the governing document of international crime, she discovered that there was originally intended to be a clause that would cover serious harm to nature, and it never made it to the final treaty, which now governs the International Criminal Court. So in a way,
and you were saying, and instead it included, and then you became
sorry. So the crimes that are currently in existence were the three that the treaty originally included. So genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Okay. And more recently, crimes of aggression has been added, and that was always the intention to add that at some point. Mm-hmm. And so ecocide would be a fifth crime. We can add it to that list. So I think Polly's strong sense of this was that she was aiming for this work to kind of bring back into place a law that should have been there. And if one just sort of stops for a moment and and thinks, what might this world be like now if 20 years ago, when that court came into existence, if ecocide had been included, and we might be in a very different position right now. Right. That just gives you a sense of the potential power of bringing this law into play.
Yeah, and it also reminds me that for instance, maybe even in the conversation with Polly, but also in conversation, for instance, with the Maori elder, I remember how they spoke about the sacred law being enshrined in the law of the tribe, how in a way ecocide is a part of tribal law. For instance, take Senegal, it's a crime to cut down a baobab tree, in a village, it's a crime. But so we could also say that when we were, indigenous to the land, when the land lived in us and we belonged in the land, it was natural for these laws to be alive in the human community. And then it was lost in history, and now it is re-found. I wonder whether we could, see it like that also. Yeah.
I mean, I think I certainly think that's one perspective. I mean, I think that it's perhaps historically there's a lot of complexity in there that perhaps isn't quite captured in what you just said. But I think that there is certainly a very different awareness of. I think there is a growing sense that we've become alienated from the land that we inhabit, and I think it's very deep. And as you say, it goes back quite a long way. So there's a whole history there. Western thinking is very dualistic. We tend to, I mean, and this is something that we can see over many centuries. So I mean, even if you go back to people like Plato, you've got an ideal versus the real. You go through the Catholic perspective, and there's spirit versus body, St. Augustine and all of that, and then you move into the Enlightenment, and you've got rationality versus emotion. So this kind of duality, even though the frameworks change, the sort of basic structure is the same, is this very kind of dualistic approach that pits the head against the heart, or the masculine against the feminine, so many dualisms. And I think that there's a way in which, it may sound strange, but there's a way in which this is a very strategic legal intervention that we're talking about with ecocide law, but it has the potential to begin to bridge that gap. And we feel that quite strongly. So when we look at international criminal law, that's where we kind of culturally decide, well, those are the worst things that we can do. And if we place damage to nature at that level, we're saying something very profound, actually. We're saying it is just as bad and wrong to seriously damage the earth as it is to damage other people, for example. Right. And that is, it's not going to change things overnight, but it certainly has the potential to begin to create sort of a new taboo. And taboos are there for a reason. There's a reason why you don't go to a government and say, can I have a permit for, to kill 500 people for my new project? I mean, it literally won't cross your mind because it's so strongly outside of what's all right. But we don't have that same kind of natural restraint or recoil from damage to the natural world. So I think there's that sort of growing sense now that we have to start recreating those connections and, acknowledging that in our systems is, I think you're right. I think there is a sense of a sort of rediscovery there. And I think it's, and perhaps one of the reasons that I say it's actually in a way more complex is that, we've kind of, in a sort of evolutionary perspective, what we're moving into, I believe now, is a broader consciousness than may have been the case, in the past, in the sense that, we now think of ourselves as, I mean, not everybody, of course, but there is a sense, and I think this goes back to maybe to the first images that were taken of the Earth from space, where we look at that globe and okay, to the best of our knowledge, in the physical universe, there's no other planet that we know of yet that has that same potential for life, and that has the same conditions that we live in, this incredible home. And it's that sense that whole is something that we all live on. And I think that planetary sense that sort of transcends tribal, village, nation, all of that, and actually goes to planetary level and sees those interconnections. I think that's new. Yeah. I certainly think it's new at a sort of cultural level. I mean, there may have been individual, I don't know, shamans or people with other levels of perception who saw that, but I think that as a culture, we're just beginning to grasp, that we are all on this same planet, and that actually it's all of our home. And it is just beginning. But yeah, I like to think that what we're doing can contribute towards that.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, and I completely agree that it feels like a spiral, and we're integrating on a much higher planetary level, yeah. And yeah, I love that you spoke about the, we could say duality of human versus nature and bridging that. And yeah, it's very touching that we have human rights and then genocide and homicide, all the others that you named at the International Court are kind of the other side of the coin. And then we have earth rights and ecocide. And yeah, I wonder whether you could just say a bit more about how these two sides of a coin are linked.
Absolutely. They are definitely complementary. And there's obviously quite a broad movement now internationally around rights of nature. And there are, I think, 20 jurisdictions where there are, for example, particular landscape features that have been granted legal personhood or that kind of thing, different forms of rights for nature. I'm going to start saying that again because I just had an alarm go off. I have no idea why. So, yeah, I'd like to do that because I think there is a complementarity there between rights of nature and ecocide law, and it is a kind of two sides of a coin. It's one side is is about the right side is sort of complemented by the responsibilities which come with the criminal law. And there's now quite a large movement globally for rights of nature, and around 20 jurisdictions now have legal personhood or other similar rights that have been granted to particular landscape features or sacred sites and so on. But it's like ecocide is what protects those rights. So in the same way as with human rights, your right to life is protected by the fact that to take your life is a crime. If it wasn't, then your right to life might be respected, it might not. But the fact that there is that boundary there really helps to protect your right to life. And so similarly, we believe that a law of ecocide can do something similar for both for rights of nature, but also, interestingly, in relation to the newest human right, which has just been agreed at the UN, which is the right to a clean and healthy environment, which has only just in the last couple of weeks been accepted and acknowledged as a universal human right, which is a phenomenal achievement. It's taken many people many years to get that in place, and there's something about that it's almost, the timing is amazing, because the conversation around ecocide is now, it's like this perfect sort of complementary anchor somehow that how do you protect our right to a clean and healthy environment? Well, by putting in place a law that says if you damage that environment severely, it's a crime. So there's an interesting kind of synchronicity and almost a kind of poetic complementarity there, sort of with what's happening right now.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah, and I think we can also just all sit with that a bit more and ponder it. It's there. And also just to hear about the spreading, for instance, of the rights of rivers and rivers that are protected and sacred sites. As you said, I think it's super inspiring to see how these two movements have come forth and are growing rapidly in parallel. Yeah, really beautiful. Yeah, and just to come back, in the description of what you do, it says, right now, in most of the world, no one is held responsible. It's time to change the rules. It's time to protect our home. We are working together with a growing global network of lawyers, diplomats, and across all sectors of civil society towards making ecocide an international crime. And I remember that back in 2019, Polly Higgins was sharing that you were about to bring, if I remember rightly, the former CEO of Shell, and also an environmental minister in Holland in front of the International Court. That was the aim back then. To be in a mock trial where their cover-up of climate change was going to be brought to a mock trial. So not, I guess you weren't going to bring them personally, but it was going to be a mock trial around that. Did that ever happen? And what are the steps you're taking now? What is the work that you're doing at the moment, concretely?
That's really interesting that you asked that, actually, because it's true. I mean, Polly held an event in The Hague in 2018, which focused around, it wasn't so much a book trial, it was the idea of a sort of hypothetical investigation. In other words, the question she was posing was, if there were a crime in place in that specific instance, she was using, the idea of climate ecocide in particular, could these particular people be prosecuted? That was the kind of thinking behind it. Now, interestingly, the reality has overtaken that hypothetical investigation by quite some way. So in a way, that the whole point of that was to show the potential of a crime of ecocide, potentially. Now, actually what happened was within, a year later at the International Criminal Court, there was actually a demand from a small Pacific Island state, Vanuatu, who we'd been in correspondence with, and we were supporting more than one, actually, small island state to potentially consider this possibility, but also bringing their voices to the table at the International Criminal Court, strategically and financially supporting them, because until that time, those climate vulnerable countries, especially the ones down in the Pacific, they might not have even, in fact, I don't believe they'd ever attended the assembly of the criminal court, even though they were members, because it wasn't felt to them to be directly relevant. But once you brought ecocide into the mix, suddenly there was a different relevance to them. And so that year in 2019, Vanuatu actually called for ecocide to be considered by the member states, with the potential of adding it as an extra crime. So suddenly, from being a kind of, how do we get attention on this subject, and how do we, move it forward, we actually had states saying, can you please consider this? And that was Vanuatu and the Maldives. That was two climate vulnerable states saying to all the other member states, this is something that's really worth considering. And so really at that point, we kind of jumped beyond the idea of doing something hypothetical. We were actually dealing with a real conversation with governments at the international level, where that suddenly began then to sort of gather momentum as a serious conversation. So in a way, that line of approach was kind of superseded, I suppose, and overtaken by the reality of the conversation picking up its own momentum.
Yeah, beautiful. And maybe just for some of our listeners who might not be aware, I'm sure most of us are, but that these are the islands that are threatened first to be overtaken by seawater with the sea
Correct.
rise.
Yeah.
And in a way, it is the loss of land, but
it's the loss of home. It's the loss of land. It's the loss of home. I mean, it's some of these islands are already starting to make provision for what happens if they have to actually move their whole populations, and that's an extraordinary thing to have to do.
I believe the first island is set to disappear in 2040.
That may well be the case. I mean, gosh, I mean, it just shows how immediate, what we're facing is.
Yeah. So, can you give us more of an overview? What you're working on at the moment. Like, how far are you away from getting this through?
Absolutely. So I think it's worth perhaps going back a little step to look at why we pursue this particular route to the ICC, and there are sort of three main reasons for that. One is kind of practical legal, and that's that the International Criminal Court, or the ICC, is the only global mechanism that directly accesses the criminal justice systems that already exist in its member states. So it's not a separate court like the Court of Human Rights or the European Court of Justice or whatever. It specifically ties in with national law. So if, say, the UK were to ratify ecocide at the International Criminal Court, it would have to then include the same law in its domestic law. So it's a very efficient way, if you like, to get the same law acknowledged in many different jurisdictions. So that's really important. And that's also important with ecocide, because often the worst culprits are transnational corporations. So they have this ability to sort of move between jurisdictions. So that the more coherence you can have, the better. The second reason is also because you want the whole world to move with you. So you don't, it's not that we wouldn't support, individual nations criminalizing ecocide. Obviously, it'd be brilliant, and there are some nations that have it in their penal codes. But there's something about bringing in a law nationally that is more worrying to governments. It feels more dangerous politically, because suddenly you might be alienating, a lot of your corporations or so on. So supporting it at the international level means that there is time, because it takes momentum and it takes global support. It takes 2/3 of those member states to move it forward. Now that could happen relatively quickly, actually, but what it means is that when it does, there's safety in numbers. You're not going to be losing your competitive edge, and neither do you have to necessarily take immediate steps legislatively. So it's politically safer, while at the same time the ultimate goal is actually better met, because you're bringing many countries together, and we all know that we all need to move in the same direction. So that's another reason. And the other aspect of that reason, of course, giving it a bit of time and momentum, is that when people can see it coming over the horizon, so when policymakers, when the corporate world can see this coming, it becomes, instead of, it's not just a stick or a deterrent, if you like, it's also potentially a carrot, because actually what it does is it empowers people to move in a new direction in the knowledge that there's going to be something in place that genuinely supports that. At the moment, finance anyway flows like water, money flows like water. It will go wherever it's allowed to go. So unless you you close a certain door, you can't open other ones. So when you can see that door approaching, or you can see that limit approaching, suddenly then all the possibilities for what could be done instead are kind of obliged to make themselves visible. So it can be quite an empowering aspect as well. The fact that there is some time, not too much, we haven't got lots of time, but some time before this law is in place, is precisely the period during which we will see change. Because it will be, the whole idea is, of course, when it's in place, there will be prosecutions. There's no question that will happen. But it's not about punishing the bad guys. It's about changing behavior. It's about actually genuinely protecting the planet so that those activities don't take place anymore. And for that to happen, people have to see it coming so that they can start making that change in direction. So that's the second reason. And the final one is more the symbolic one. And this speaks more to what we've been talking about already, which is more about the moral imagination of, our cultural understanding, the ability of potentially, if serious harm to nature is criminalized, it starts to equate to damage to people and damage to property. We start to think of it in a different way. And I think in the long term, that realignment that is actually it's both more symbolic but also more profound, it is actually potentially the most important thing. And in terms of where we are in that campaign, there are already 16 member states of the ICC who are talking about this, either at parliamentary or at government level. There's not a proposal on the table yet. It would be too early for that. The conversation needs to be a little louder, and there needs to be more momentum behind it before that. There's enough states together to sort of move that forward. But the conversation is growing very fast, and there are more states behind closed doors that we've been in conversation with that simply haven't spoken about it publicly. And what we can say is that even, some of the biggest players in the business community, for example, are now calling for it. Just last week, the International Corporate Governance Network, which is a massive network of asset managers who can, control investment into, tens of trillions of assets worldwide. Their statement that they submitted to COP26 included a recommendation for governments to criminalize ecocide.
Wow.
So that just gives you a sense of how far we've come in the last couple of years, and particularly the last few months. So
That's
I think
very interesting, very inspiring. Yeah.
And there's one other thing that I think it's worth mentioning in terms of the progress of what we're doing. And I think there's been a huge milestone this year, and that's been the emergence of an actual legal definition of ecocide. And there have been working definitions over the past decade or more, including Polly's and others, but they've always been a lawyer or a group of lawyers saying, we think this should be a crime and this is what we think it should look like. On this occasion, it actually arose from a political demand from parliamentarians in Sweden who said, can you provide us with something that we could actually submit to our government potentially, that actually could be used by a government. So it's not just a wish list, it's actually something that could be politically, practically used. So, and on the basis of that, we were able to convene a panel of international lawyers from all around the world with different backgrounds, criminal law, environmental law, climate law, to bring together and debate and evolve a definition that could be presented to governments. And that definition is wonderfully concise, and it's so concise it fits on the back of our business cards. I don't know, I've got my blur on, but you can see you can see that there, or at least Kosha can. It's really just one sentence, and it's ecocide means unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. And it's really short, but it's incredibly concise, but incredibly dense. And it's wonderfully balanced between preventing the worst harms, but also acknowledging that there is existing law and that this must mesh in and reinforce existing law. And also to catch, with that word wanton, which is it's a lovely word, actually. It's almost a sort of old-fashioned word, but it is a legal term, is this idea of capturing those instances where something might be permitted legally, but the consequences are so disproportionately severe that it merits, being part of that definition. So that moment of that definition coming out was extraordinary for us. It was almost like we'd been building all these circuits for many years and suddenly somebody switched them on. It was like, the media suddenly woke up to it. The world suddenly woke up to it. The politicians woke up to it. And I think we're starting to see the growing results of that conversation really starting to grow now.
Oh, it's lovely seeing the life and the joy flow through you, just the passion and the enthusiasm. And just again, to everybody listening now, just Googling ecocide, this new definition is the first thing that comes up. So, everyone can just go and read it through, you can create your own little business card with the ecocide on it if you like. Yeah. And, I'm reminded as you speak that I know in the Tao Te Ching, it says if people are governed, you could say, I'm putting this completely in my words now, but if people live from sacred law, we don't need moral laws, we don't need to put, fence off certain areas so money can't flow there. We wouldn't need to do that if the sacred law lived in us. And, that's part of how we see the effect, the symptoms of trauma, that we need these laws. But at the same time, I can sense the restoration of trauma, the healing of trauma in the creation of this language. As you say, how much went before in order to find this new language that is crystal clear and rings like a bell and really goes out into the world, changing something. So congratulations on it. And I'm grateful for all of us that this is happening and growing. So maybe we slowly come to an end just by, what are your hopes and fears for COP26, maybe to hear a bit about that?
I think this is going to be an interesting moment. The clues in the name to a certain extent. 26, that's a lot of years of negotiation. And we're still only crawling in a direction that we really need to be sprinting in very fast. And so what I suppose for us, our aim, and we've organized some wonderful events for COP, and please do go to our website, stopecocide.earth, and you'll see under our media, I think you'll see all our events, and what we're really wanting to do there is bring this word, this concept into the conversation, kind of in the light of, yes, obviously we hope that new resolutions and more ambition and more goodwill and all of those things come out of it. Of course, we need all of that. But let's face it, it hasn't so far been enough. And actually having this additional thread to that conversation, this additional parameter that can be put in place, that can potentially be, a kind of an empowering bridging piece. And I think what you said earlier about literally just now about, if the law lives within us, we don't necessarily need it with, on the outside of us. We see this law as being a sort of a bridging piece in that way. Again, it's within the current system, but what it does is it starts to shift the direction towards something new. And we know that criminal law can do that. And we know that it does internalize. Even in the UK, we can just think about the Child Protection Act from 1989. you know, I still can't quite believe that before that time it was fine to beat your child if you wanted to discipline your child that way. You know, and actually now, if you stop someone in the street and say, is it okay to beat your child as a disciplinary measure, most people will recoil from that and they will say, no, that's not acceptable. And so what that shows is that both there's a shift in the consciousness that allows the law to be put in place, but the fact that the law is in place is what brings the whole culture with it. So it's you know, it's kind of both. And I guess our, you know, our kind of hope for this conference is that potentially we can add something that is currently, you know, that has always ultimately been missing from these discussions, but that now becomes very, very relevant with what, you know, how stark things are in the world and how we can see things unfolding. So yeah, I mean, I think we're confident that that will happen. And yeah, I mean, we feel like it's going to be an important moment for this very fast moving conversation, and of course every listener to this session, and it's been gorgeous speaking with you, Kosha, is that everyone can contribute to a conversation. We all have networks, big ones, small ones. We have friends, we have workplaces, and what we know from our own experience and from looking at the Google Analytics and all of that stuff, we can see that it's where the conversations happen. That is where the political dial is pushed. So just know, I mean, there's many other things you can do to support this organization. You can check on our website. There's a whole menu that to suit everybody. But if you do no other thing, talk about ecocide, talk about ecocide law.
Brilliant. Yeah. And that's what we've done here today, because my sense is, you know, this is really bringing us closer again to sacred law, and that is part of the restoration of, yeah, where our world has been fragmented. Yeah, to bring that back together. So thank you for the work that you do, Jojo, and yeah, take care of yourself while you work in this very fast river, it feels like. And yeah, brilliant to feel just how far it's come even in the 2 years since I last really had a conversation about this. Beautiful. So
thank you so much.
and go well. And I hope we meet each other somewhere at COP.
Oh, that would be wonderful. Check out our events and come along. It'd be great to see you. Thank you so much for this opportunity. It's been great.